What is up, everyone? Welcome back. The month of March. This is like the month of bass fishing down here in the Southeast. You know, it's in the South, this is like when towards the beginning of March, it's definitely, pre-spawn. This is the prime time you hear pre-spawn. What is pre-spawn bass fishing? It is obviously before they move back in the backs of these pockets, like this one right here, when they start to spawn. I feel like the first big push of like spawners typically happens late March, early April in the South. Now, I'm excluding a couple places like, Florida and some of the places in Texas. The biggest, largest push of a lot of our fish will happen like that first, second, third week of April. So this is the time of year that I am big on power fishing techniques. So this is the time of year that you can burn and turn, especially when you have water clarity that's a little bit more stained. Recently, here in late February in a lot of the areas of the country, pretty much all over the South and pretty much like the Midwest, we've had a lot of rain. We had a big front of rain and snow showers come through, which muddied up our rivers, our creeks, and a lot of our lakes. Which that helps typically is that raises the water to a lot of times close to full pool, and in turn, it muddies up the water and makes the bass go a little bit shallower. The warmer days have definitely helped that out a little bit as well. But overall, that's really going to set things up for the month of March to be a power fishing month. I love that. So I selected some rods that I think that are going to be rods, reels, the whole setups that I feel like it's going to be the very key in generating some really big bites this month. And so we're going to jump into it right now. Before we jump into that, I will say that I had a comment. Make sure you guys comment below on the lakes you guys want me to break down. A lot of times I like to do that just because they're lakes that I don't know anything about, and I'm breaking them down just as how I would look on a map, which gives you an understanding of like what I'm thinking about. This week, we're going to go to Lake Sinclair down in Georgia. Never been there before. Very little about it. I've never made a cast there. So we're going to talk about a little bit on Lake Sinclair, not St. Clair, and dive into sort of like what these baits and what I'm going to select and why. So let's just jump into it right now. First off, the month of March, especially this first front end, I'm going to say it is definitely a heavy cranking month, okay? Picking up a crankbait, preferably whatever your personal favorite is, but you can't go wrong with a DT6. It's just like a perfect all-around depth. If I'm fishing shallower with a DT6, I'll throw like 14, even 17-pound line if I want to get it a little shallower. But if I'm fishing like more traditional, like rocky riprap banks, stuff like that, then I'm going to keep it with like 12-pound fluorocarbon. That's really key. This color right here is Mule. Actually, my buddy Kyle Welcher turned me on to this color over the years, and I've really become one of my favorite pre-spawn colors. Of course, you can't go wrong with the new classic Craw colors. Actually, let me see if I have that. Hold on one sec. So there's some new colors like the classic Craw color that's just coming out, great for muddy water. So it's a little bit darker red. So I like a darker red a lot of times. So like say the water is a little bit dirty for Mule, I'll go to this like more like red, classic Craw color, like a darker red for like a little bit of stain to like muddy. And then when it's muddy, here's a new color as well, Crystal Craw. So more of a brighter, some chartreuse, has a little bit of that red in there, has a good combination of it all. So this is obviously a more contrasting, going to be better for a little bit dirtier water or in low light conditions or, when it's cloudy or whatnot. So this is sort of like, these are 3 Craw colors that I'm going to highly recommend depending on the water clarity that you're fishing. To me, that's the move. Oh, you'll see on this DT6 that I have on this rod right here. This is my 7.2 cranking rod that I swapped these hooks out. These are number 6 red line trebles. They're just insanely sharp, okay? So to me, if the fish are slapping at your bait, I'm really a big fan of like a smaller diameter hook. One thing that people do not pay attention to, and I'm gonna be honest with you, I've done this myself, is you wanna pay attention when you're selecting treble hooks, is having a decent barb. So you don't want it to be too thick, but you don't want it to be too thin and too small, because that thickness of your barb, you want a sharp hook, but your second most important thing is your barb. Really, that's like really important. Sometimes it's actually more important to have a big enough barb, because once it goes past into, in their mouth and it hooks those fish, that's what ultimately, when they jump, that's what helps the hook stay pinned. And if you don't have a big enough barb, they come and jump off. So that's something to think about when you're selecting the right replacement hook. And these hooks that come on them, these are number 5, caught a lot of bass on them. So the only difference between these guys, if they're biting really good, these are sharp right out of the package. Like all the sharp minimum five. The thing is, when you crank around a lot of rock this time of year, you'll end up dulling your hooks out. So your hook will get dulled. It doesn't mean that the hook's a bad hook. It just means that you're obviously grinding it on the rocks and it's bumping around rocks. It's going, a couple of them will get dull. So paying attention to that and replacing your hooks. Sometimes in a tournament, I'll replace my hooks twice in a day. Or I'll have a file and I'll file my hook, that front hook or whichever hook's actually catching the majority of that rock, once or twice in a day. Just making sure that it's good to go, you know what I'm saying? So that's really important there. It just all dependent on your personal preference. As far as gear ratio, I've been sort of playing around with these Abu Xenons. This reel right here casts unbelievably well. I think it's a 6/8 to 1 gear ratio, I'm pretty sure. 6/8 to 1 gear ratio. It's under the reel. All right, so I couldn't see it. 6/8 to 1 gear ratio, that is exactly what this one is. And it's an awesome reel, and it has a unique drag system. So we're like, it's like a spinning reel. It has a clicking drag, so you know when your drag's going out. I actually took me a little getting used to, but I actually like it. It's just a good low profile reel if you're like in the market for a cranking reel. Seems really nice on that side of things, and I can back my drag off enough. It's sort of, once I've gotten so used to a spinning reel, when you're cranking and like you lock up on a fish, like, you know, pulls drag, you know, like, hey, to ease up. That's sort of a nice little piece of this to allow you to sort of ease up a little bit and let the fish take some line, you know what I'm saying? So it's good to sort of, I actually have gotten used to it, and it is pretty nice. So let's jump in on the map here, going over here to the Lowrance unit and picking up the C map and looking at Lake Sinclair. I did not realize it was that big. Typically, okay, this is the whole lake. There's Lake Oconee, I believe it's north of here, but like just like this lake right here. So obviously these bigger creek arms like that I'm looking at on the north end of the lake, all of those places are gonna have the biggest flow. And the main river right here is gonna have the biggest flow from like incoming water. So I'm assuming, just because you can see 3 major creek arms right there, that water's gonna be pretty muddy in this arm right here. It doesn't mean it's gonna be necessarily muddy in this arm because it comes from Lake Oconee. I think this is Oconee up north. So this arm might not be as dirty as the arm over here to the left. Now, muddy water, I don't want it to be just destroyed muddy water, but I want a good stain. You know, a foot and a half, you know, foot of visibility, 6 inches of visibility is about a perfect stain for pre-spawn bass fishing and throwing a DT6. As far as like what I'm going to be fishing, of course, you cannot go wrong with bridges this time of year, especially like one like this. I'm not going to necessarily say this bridge. I mean, that bridge should be cool, but I'm looking for something like this, a pre-spawn bridge that these fish might spawn in the back of this creek arm right here. This bridge right here would be a perfect scenario of something where I'd pull up. There's riprap, there's deep water, and there's a spawning area in the back where these fish are going to funnel in and ultimately try to spawn here in the next 2 or 3 weeks. Perfect place to start and check around. So I'm going to start over here in these corners, and I'm going to crank all the way down these. And of course, spending some time around those like corners is going to be important. But a lot of times the fish will want to be on like the side closest to the bank, or they'll be wanting to actually be where the current is running, or the little bit of flow on that body of water on these rocky corners on the side. So figuring that out, every day is different. I've seen it in bridge. I used to crank bridges all the time. That's all I used to do back home, and Morris and Geist even a little bit. These places like that, we're always understanding like what the fish wanted that given day. You know, and it changes throughout the spring. A lot of times they'll be over there in the corners, and they'll be like along the riprap down that way, or they'll be on the gold corners like that. Now, if you do not have bridges that have riprap on your lake that you're fishing, typically what I'm looking for is little turns like this, little harder turns. I've shown you guys that, but I start to transition a little bit more rather than main river stuff. I start to transition mouths of pockets. Like this guy right here, you can see you have a flatter point right here. This is not like what I would call a bluff bank. This would be more of a steeper where those contours on the C-map compress down. Those little places like that, those little 50-yard little stretches where that you're gonna have a lot more depth. It might be deep for that particular pocket, where those fish can stage right there. Then typically the bait's gonna be present around those areas, crayfish and stuff like that. Those are all good places to check out. Now, the one thing I'm gonna say about this place, the north-facing pockets typically have historically been the areas that the fish will spawn the first. So the first group of fish will spawn on those northern-facing pockets. Okay, so now that I have this on north up, you'll see what I'm talking about. So the place we were just talking about would be a north-facing pocket. That place right there is literally a north-facing pocket that would probably be a place those fish would funnel in and spawn first because it gets the most sunlight and typically will warm up the fastest. There's a lot of other variables that go into that, but that is just my general opinion on cranking this time of year. I'm trying to sort of gear my mind towards where the fish are going to go, and those are going to be places that I'm going to definitely focus on. Okay, so now you guys got a little bit of the cranking aspect of this. I'm going to put this guy down. I might have to make a couple casts here later on and reel a couple in real quick on that one. Next on the lineup is a spinnerbait. You cannot go wrong with a spinnerbait this time of year. Actually, I would say this is probably the most underrated lure in the springtime that you do not see professional bass anglers throw all that much, especially in this scenario when you have a little stained water. I really like that. This is a 1/2 ounce accent spinnerbait. This is the one I work with them on. Like, I like a double willow if the water's just a little stained to it, but I also like a red kicker blade with an orange kicker blade. I don't know why I call it red. Orange kicker blade with that Indiana blade on there as well. So this guy right here is spring ding. This one right here, I believe we call that like, hold up, I'll tell you exactly what it's called. Okay, so they call this one the double crossbones. It actually comes back from, it's an inside joke from DC and I when we talked about when we were actually up on Mille Lacs. We talked about double crossbone. It was pretty awesome. We caught a lot of bass. Double crossbones, a spinnerbait with the double willows. I like that one a lot. I think sometimes we underestimate how much flash and how much vibration you get on a double willow spinnerbait. You don't have to throw a single Colorado that much. I'm not a huge fan of a single Colorado unless it's really muddy. I'm not a big time single Colorado fan. You can't reel it fast, so I can't cover a lot of water. Now, if you're fishing in a zone that you know the bass are in, you want to keep it in their face and the water's really muddy, then it's an advantage. But it's a disadvantage if you're trying to cover water and the fish are biting really well, right? So to me, that's why I like a double willow more consistently. And then even like a Colorado, Indiana, like this guy that's 3/8, he works really well, and he does not have as much resistance as a single Colorado has. And you get a little bit more flash, and adding that little bit of that orange kicker blade just gives a little, I don't know what the fish think it is. It might be a thing that just started, I don't know who originally started that. I remember throwing this back when I was 12 years old, but an orange kicker blade has been a staple in the bass fishing industry. Some people are like, oh, well, it's more like crawfish. I mean, listen, a spinnerbait is definitely not imitating crawdad. So I don't know what it does. I think it just adds a little bit different color. It might not matter at all, but to me, it matters. So that's why I always rig it up. You know what I'm saying? I mean, as far as a trailer, that I am a big fan of a trailer on the back of my spinnerbait. I will also add a trailer hook from time to time. If the fish are biting it really, really well, I do not put a trailer hook on there. I like to have a trailer because I think that ultimately the fish get the bait better. But that being said, if I'm around fish that are really nipping it, I will put a trailer, like normally a 1/0 trailer. I don't like to have a 2 or 3/0, 4/0. Like, I don't want a big trailer hook back there. I want something that if the fish nips at it, it catches him, and I have a chance to get that fish in the boat. So that's the reason behind it, but I'm big on the actual trailer aspect. If I'm around bigger fish, I'm gonna reach for a 4 1/4 inch freeloader, the traditional size freeloader. If I'm around smaller bait fish and a little bit, I want a smaller profile, I'll throw a 3-inch mare on the back and change that up accordingly. So that's sort of my two trailers that I like to throw. I mean, I've caught them on both, but that's sort of like the two trailers that I typically go with. As far as rod, reel line, this is my 7.0 medium heavy action rod. Okay, this is the 2.0 Jacob Wheeler Signature Series, 6:8 to 1 gear ratio reel. 7:1 to gear ratio is fine. 7:3 to 1 is fine, but you just have to slow down a little bit more. I like that. 17-pound Suffix Advanced Fluorocarbon is what I recommend. That's what I throw. I just like a little bit heavier. I don't really like throwing 14 or a 15-pound test. I just feel like if you're not a guy that like really reties your line a lot, like reties your knot a lot, you're probably gonna break one off eventually on 15-pound tests. Just to let you know. So spinnerbait right there. I'm gonna go and jump over here to the lake and see sort of like what we just talked about with a little bit of the DT action. This is a little bit different. What I'm looking for, the spinnerbait action, is definitely laydowns in wood. So flatter areas, we're gonna slide on up this river, and I'm gonna go into areas, so like a lot of these places, like right here, these are like deadfalls. So great scenario, still north-facing pockets. I still feel like these fish are gonna be funneling in. Something that has a little bit of depth in the middle. This is like that's a 30-foot contour that's coming into here, so that's really good. And then something that has enough flats in the back of this place, so you see the red contours like this. So probably a bank, like a little short pocket like that or something like that. Anywhere there's laydowns or like laydowns, rock, chunkier rock, like that's when I'm gonna really be throwing that spinnerbait, reeling it by the laydowns, reeling it around docks. That is like, you gotta think like visual cover for me this time of year is everything, because a lot of the fish will live in 2 to 5 feet of water, so you can visually go down the bank. Okay, there's a laydown right here, there's a laydown right there. This laydown right here comes out just a little bit, it's probably in 2 foot of water. That laydown up there doesn't come out as far, but you can start to see, you start reading the bank types, you start seeing things, especially when the water's down, like right here. I can see, okay, it gets steeper right here, it gets flatter right over here. It just you're just constantly using your mind and processing information, and that's what's fun about this. So there's not as many laydowns on this side over here, but I could see them being in the back of this pocket. Don't get me wrong, they definitely could be. To me, I'm thinking these lead-in banks, these steeper lead-in banks that have a little bit of these wood is going to be better than all the way in the back in the flat. Now, maybe towards the late end of March, if you're watching this video, those fish might already be back there, and you might have to switch your tactic depending on the water clarity and all that stuff. That's just my mindset, like how I look at it. Don't be afraid to fish the main river as well, because this is the one thing, I'll say this. Sometimes as fishermen, we have a problem, we have an issue. What happens is we get the first spell of warm weather, and what happens? We think all the bass are going to spawn. That is not happening, okay? There's still bass out there in the middle of the lake right now that are out there still feeding on bait and doing their thing. There's not as many of them out there as there was in the wintertime. They're not all doing that, but don't lock yourself into thinking there's only one pattern to catch a bass. There's bass in the main lake, there's bass in these pockets that we're talking about, in this lake right here, there's bass all over. But typically there's a dominant pattern where the majority of the bass are pushing to, and that's why the pre-spawn's so cool, is because they all have to get there eventually. Over the next month and a half, at least down here south, and really even in the Midwest for the most part, these bass are having to go up there shallow and starting to spawn. So your first initial spawners are going to spawn all the way in the backs of some of these places like this. Flat pockets, north-facing pockets, all that. That's the first initial push. Then you have these fish that'll spawn back there, then they'll start spawning on these lead-in banks, they'll start spawning on the main lake, and as the year goes on into May, and even like the last spawn really happens here late May, maybe possibly in June, there's a couple, but really the middle of May is really the last spawn. Down south, or even really for the most Midwest. So then that's the last push of spawners will be, they're wanting to get out there towards the main. So not really a technique or a thing, but just giving you an understanding mindset as you're thinking about what you're going to do in the month of March. Don't think that you have to be locked into just one thing, right? Don't think that. Don't be narrow-minded. There's a lot more. The bass are, they all have different minds. They think completely differently. I've learned to understand a little bit of it. They always throw you for a loop. So spinnerbait's going to be on that list. Let's go ahead and, and talk about another bait. If your water clarity is a little bit cleaner this time of year, and you're going down the lakes and like sometimes the lower ends, it's one of the best times of year to pick up a glide bait. I'm really a big fan of a glide. I've caught some giant ones on a glide bait this time of year. Typically, you're going to see some of the biggest bass in your lake throwing a glide bait in the month of March, because they tend to get up there shallow. And don't be afraid, even in this water clarity right here, I'm gonna say this water clarity, let me see how far I can see this bait down. I'm gonna say I can see that glide, it's an Arashi glide right here. I can see that bait down a foot. This is the thing, do not be afraid to throw a glide bait in a foot of visibility. They will absolutely crush it. You have to, and listen, you have to be sort of like ready to not get a ton of bites, but that's not always true either. I've had times when I've gone out and had 15 bites up shallow in a single day on a glide. That's just figuring out the right glide and the right shape for you. Like this Arashi glide is one I throw a lot. I throw the OG Shad a decent amount. There's a couple other little custom ones that I throw. DS Customs, I throw them. But I always have this one tied on because I've caught actually the two biggest bass, two of the bigger bass I've caught this time of year on the lake that I'm on right now, the Chickamauga, have came on this exact bait. Now, not this exact one, the one that I actually had to look at it because there were some teeth marks. I was looking for the teeth marks. I'm like, I have caught some on this one right here. The one that I caught them on had some major teeth marks up the bait because it was like a 9-pounder that had it choked and it was like thrashing. I actually boat flipped it, which don't do that. Just a reminder, do not do that. I caught it, but it was not, I thought it was like a 5-pounder and it turned out to be a 9. Long story short, it was a pretty epic, like it knocked so much slack in my line. That was fun. That was a lot of fun. So this bait right here is awesome. You don't have, the one thing I also think a lot of people get a little bit spooked, if you will, from throwing a glide bait because they think they have to have a glide bait rod. I have thrown several. I don't think you have to have like the specific glide bait rod, right? You can throw like an Arashi glide on a 7.3 heavy. This is a 7.7 heavy. This is actually a little bit of a lighter heavy. This is a Select Series rod that I throw all the time. This is sort of like my mag draft, glide bait, scrounger, single swim bait offshore rod. Just a good all around like 7.7, a little bit lighter on the aspect. Yes, I mean, I can use it for that, but there's multiple purposes for this rod that I'm using it for, you know what I'm saying? So locking yourself into saying I have to have a glide bait rod, don't necessarily think you have to do that. I will say, you do not, just because you're throwing a big bait does not mean you want a super heavy action rod. You want a parabolic bend, which is you want to have more bend in your rod than you would think. This is not a punching rod. So I don't know if you guys can see that, but it actually bends a little bit more down that rod. And that allows for that bait to sort of load up when I cast it. Also, when a fish bites it, you want a little bit of give. These are treble hooks. Think about it. These are treble hooks. They bite it. You lock it, they load up, you pull in, your hookup ratio is a little bit better. If you get a too heavy of a glide bait rod, you'll just rip the hooks right out of them. I've made this mistake. I used to always think big baits, you need a big glide bait rod, you need this big giant rod. No, you don't need that. Now, if you're throwing like a big giant glide, like a Hinkle or a Boss or something like that, like a bigger glide, you need a bigger, sturdier rod, of course. But I throw 20-pound Suffix advanced fluorocarbon on this rod and I just roll with it. You know, I mean, you don't have to go too crazy with it. I mean, you can even throw 17. Now, I wouldn't do that necessarily with like all your glide baits because you can cast them off. I mean, that is something. And you can throw, like, if you want them to float higher, the big thing with a glide bait, not getting too far in depth on this, there's nuances within it. I might put 2 lighter wire hooks on this Arashi because I want it to float higher because I feel like the fish are shallower and they're around shallow wood and they're getting ready to spawn. Or I have an Arashi that I have thicker and heavier hooks on there, like this one right here. These are actually 2 different kinds of hooks that I literally will put 2 heavier hooks on there because I'm fishing that bait out there deeper. So I can change the depth. I'm fishing 3 to 5 feet of water rather than a foot to 3 foot, or I want that bait down there in that 3 foot to 4 foot depth zone. So changing your hook size, now you can also wrap lead wire around there. You could do a lot of different things. If you're fishing the generally shallower depth zone, which is typical for this time of year in March, where the fish are gonna be at, you don't have to do the lead wire on your hooks. You just need to change your hook out accordingly, as long as it's not too big where it's gonna come back and hook itself and then ultimately make your bait run weird. That's the only thing you have to watch for. That's just sort of the, I've talked about glide baits enough on here. You guys probably know a little bit about it, but I wanted to go into it because I feel like it's something that it is probably, if I had 1 month and I'm like, you want to catch a big one on a glide bait, probably it'd have to be the month of March. Have to be. It's the time. It's the time to catch a big one. So that's gonna, now sort of like talking about that bait sort of brings up another bait that I think that needs to be talked about a little bit as well. And it's one that I've had, I think, in a couple times in my top baits of the month, in the month of April. I think last year I had it. And that's just a mag draft. A mag draft's a really good bait. Mega Bass Mag Draft. It's like the original harness swim bait. They do a good job. I've never been like a huge fan of a mag draft because you have a certain speed, you have to reel the mag draft. I like the 6-inch. I know they came out with a new 5-inch, it's cool. But for me, like, I'm gonna throw like a 6-inch for the most part with this bait. Like when you get down that 5-inch, it's such a fine tune, like they change the weight of it, it doesn't kick right. I mean, to me, I don't mind that. If I'm gonna throw a smaller profile swim bait, I'll show you guys the one I throw. I'm not throwing this mag draft. So 6-inch mag draft, 17-pound line, same rod that I'm throwing that glide bait on, 7.7, heavy action select rod, 17-pound line, Suffix advanced fluorocarbon, all that good stuff. And this is sort of like when the water gets too clean For that spinnerbait, around those laydowns, around those docks, like these fish are pre-spawning on shallow cover, this is when I'm going to be throwing that Mad Draft. Now this one has a lot of dust on him from collecting dust over the last year that it's been rigged up on this rod. It's a good color. Like, you don't have to change, your colors are just dependent on where you're at in water clarity, but your whites and your shad patterns typically work pretty well for this time of year, and it can get some bites to be had. And this is going to be a good bait to be throwing for the next month and a half. I mean, it's not a huge bait. It's not something that those, you know, 2.5 pounder won't eat, or 3 pounder won't eat, but there's times that it does generate big bites. And when a spinnerbait is too much for those fish and too much vibration and flash, a swim bait can be a great way to generate some bites. Now, that being said, I will also say that if you do not like spending, you know, whatever, $12.99, $15 for a swim bait, there is other options that I recommend for fishing shallower in this scenario. So if I'm around a lot of cover, I really, really like this 4-inch mare on the back of a HD hybrid swim bait hook. This is like sort of like a typical flashy hook. This is one's VMC of that option. Having I think this is a 1/4, I believe, on there. It's going to be great for shallower water, so I can reel. So for this is not, so say I don't want to throw that bait, and it's not as good around wood, but I have a spinner bait, and the spinner bait catches them, but it's getting too much vibration. This would be a good contrast or compromise to generating some bites shallower, because you have a weedless hook, works really well for that. Weedless hook. Go ahead and rig it up. You have a little bit of flash, not too much flash like with a double willow, and you're able to change your swim bait out accordingly. I think sometimes we forget about it, you know, this system and this setup, and it's something that I've played around with more recently that I think gets a lot of bites. The only issue with this thing is you can't skip it, right? You're not going to be able to skip it as easy because you do have this blade. You can, but this little blade right here flapping on the water does not make it the easiest in that scenario. So that being said, a swim bait like this guy, or if you're in open water, just a literally a mare on a jig head. Now, I do recommend this. One thing I will say, if I am fishing a mare on a jig head with like 15-pound line, like power fishing, I do throw a bigger hook. So this is a hybrid swim bait jig head. This is the one I throw on like 12-pound line when I'm fishing out offshore or I'm fishing on corners and stuff. But I want a little bit more bite in the hook, because when when one short strikes me, or when I make a little pitch up there to a laydown or next to a dock and one comes out there and eats it, I have a tendency to slack line the hook set, right? I go whack. And so what you want in that scenario, you want a little bit more bite from your line tied to your hook point. So I'll go in and I'll have a 4/0 hook. So I have like a little just 1/4 ounce jig head with a 4/0 BMC in it that I had, you know, one of these local tackle shops that I had. I bought a whole bunch of them. That I just like, hey, I just put it on there, rig it up, put some super glue on there, and that's what I reel around. 3/16, 1/4. You can probably throw an 1/8 as well if you wanted to, if they're shallower. You can change that up. So don't necessarily, you have to lock into the Mad Draft thing, because the thing is, Mad Draft, being that its bottom has a hook towards the bottom, you can't reel that bait through a lot of cover, and it is frustrating at times. So having a couple of different options in smaller swim baits is a good way to generate some bites. You don't have to lock into one swim bait. There's a lot of different swim baits out there. There's a lot of different line throughs out. You can go on for days. But here's a couple options that have worked for me, and something that I really like to do. So that being said, let's talk about a little bit where I'm going to throw these swim baits. Sort of jumping down, since we were up in the river section here, let's go ahead and slide down the lake a little bit. Typically, the biggest concentrations of bass are going to live in the major creeks on these bodies of water. So this Island Creek, I'm sure that it's got some bass. Rocky Creek sounds good to me. It's got some rocks in it probably. I'm just going to go out on a limb. Let's just slide into Rocky Creek. Some of the biggest bass in the lake typically live on the lower third of a lake, okay? They typically live on the lower third of the lake. Let's slide into Rocky Creek, and the areas that I'm going to focus on are typically going to be, I'm not going to go all the way in the back of Rocky Creek. I'm going to go midways, okay? So I'm going to go from like the front to midways back. So any little pockets and corners, still looking for those fish to be pre-spawn, getting ready to spawn. All these little short pockets, areas like this, the main pocket right here, I would assume this is probably going to be a better pocket come probably April, maybe like late March. They're probably not going to move up in here yet. They're probably still out there chasing bait. But maybe this pocket right here, maybe not the very back of the creek, but this creek arm that sort of goes back in here, but like right in this area. That'd be a perfect sort of midway back in that little creek arm. Boom, I'm going to roll in there. I'm gonna wind that mad draft and wind, you know, the mare around and fish some areas that have any like lay down trees, anything like that. And then I'll sort of work my way back out. If the water's pretty dirty in the back, I can work my way back out and fish for some of those fish that are still pre-spawning coming up there to spawn and doing their thing. So that is sort of like my mind works. Like when I go down the lake, the water clarity typically changes unless just the whole lake has a lot of stain to it. And you're gonna have a chance at some big fish because I mean, typically the lower end of the lake has like some of the biggest bass in the lake. Not all of them, but I would say like if I had to pick 10, if there's 10 lakes, I would say 6 out of 10, the majority, 6 out of 10, the biggest bass in the lake live on the lower end. Pretty good odds if you are just sort of chancing it and trying to catch the biggest bass in the lake and you don't know anything about it. Okay, so we do have one more rod, well, actually 2 more rods set up right here. You got to have a flipping stick. I do not have a spinning rod in this lineup, so if you were looking for a forward-facing sonar class, you can go back in the videos and watch a little bit about what I was utilizing. You can't go wrong with a mooch minnow and a freeloader. Freeloader for sure if the water's staying, mooch minnow if the water's clean. This time of year, it still catches them. March is still a great time to use forward-facing sonar, but this is the time of year, again, like I feel like power fishing is such a, it is the perfect time to power fish, right? So when you get the opportunity, when in Rome, you got to do what the Romans do, right? You got to go out there and you got to have some fun, and it's time to go pick up a big stick with big line and go up there and have a good time. Now, with the Bronco bug just coming off of a top 10 finish down in Florida, utilizing this bait and getting the auto qualifying. If you didn't get to see that video, you can go back into several videos. It was pretty insane. Caught some giants on this bait right here. The big key with this bait, to me, all right, so the big theme of this time of year is like I transitioned from a jig to when they started thinking about spawning, I really like going back to a soft plastic. Like it's something about a soft plastic that generates so many more bites when the fish are starting to think about spawning than a jig does. That's when I transition to a soft plastic, and I sort of lock into that when I'm flipping shallow from here on out the rest of the year. So you guys talk about, I talk about a jig a lot throughout the wintertime months when I'm dragging around, I'm flipping around, but from here on out, I'm probably going to be flipping some sort of creature bait just because I feel like, or a worm or something like that, because I feel like that's the best way to generate bites. Now that being said, hook and line and all that good stuff is important with this. My favorite weight size is a 3/8 when I'm covering water. 5/16 is the best size that I sort of like my all-around size when I'm fishing up the shallow and I think the fish are actually spawning. And a 1/4 for April is probably my #1 size because you want that slower fall. It's a little bit easier. It's really, when they're real spawning, you go in these places and you see them pushing bluegill and you can't visually see them, but you know the water's dirty and the fish are up there doing that. I actually go down in my weight size. So, but day in and day out, a 3/8 is a perfect one, tungsten weight. The one thing I will tell you with this bait, so it has a really cool undulating action, has a lot of weight to him. So he's really pretty heavy. I made it to where this hinge right here had a lot more flow and has a lot more action. But when that bait hits the bottom, having that little crawl kick is important to me. And this time of year before the fish spawn, something that is so interesting to me is how big that a lot of these fish around the country, they'll get on crawdads right before they go to spawn. That's why you see the crawdad crankbaits play so well. That's why you start to see craw type of baits generate so many bites. I feel like it's more so the females or something. Now, I might be wrong. If you're a biologist and you can tell me right now, you can hop on this in comments and say you're wrong. I've been told several times that like the females need some sort of something with the crawfish, help get their eggs ready to spawn, and a lot of times this is why they gorge themselves with crayfish. Factual, not. I'm just telling you right now, the month of March, they're eating crawdads in your lake, period, bar none. And the story, I don't care if you're a male, female, it doesn't matter. If you're a male bass or female bass, it does not matter. They're eating crayfish. If there is a crayfish there, they will hunt them out and they will catch them. They will eat them. Great imitator for that. I'm also a great bluegill imitator. So as far as rods, I mean, my favorite all around is a 7.3 heavy, okay? 7.3 heavy is your perfect pitching all-around flipping rod, okay? You can pitch around wood, you can pitch around docks. It gives you sort of enough power to get fish out of laydowns, but it's not too much to be able to make those accurate cast or little roll cast around a boat dock, you know what I'm saying? So that's sort of like my favorite, like little light flipping, light pitching, and realistically it's pitching, it's not flipping, because I mean, I made like 3 flips the total time I was in. Flipping is this. You take your line and you're just like, whoop. It's like that scissor, boom. That is flipping. I've caught like 2 bass in my entire career doing that. Majority of it is all pitching. You're pitching it out there, letting it fall. It's going to the bottom, bop, bop. good to go. So that is when I'm talking about flipping and pitching, it's really pitching. And that's what the majority of bass anglers they call flipping and pitching, but it is pitching. It is pitching. Let's not mess this up. Colors, you guys know the drill. I love the black, blue, green pumpkin. That's a great color. Candy bugs are really good one that I caught them on in Florida. This time of year, I think black, blue, green pumpkin, California Craw is a good one in the stained water. Of course, your green pumpkins, your green pumpkin magics are some of my favorites. Can't go wrong with that. Tilapia magic is a new color in the lineup as well. The last thing I will also hit on this, actually low-key, if you guys have noticed, I've had a little cough and all this stuff during this time. Hopefully Nick edited the majority of it out because I apologize. Have a little sniffle. I was flying back and there was a young child in the back of, flying back from a business meeting, and I flying back, and Alicia and I are flying back, and this kid's back there, like a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, just coughing. I'm like, we're getting sick for sure. Yep, we got it. The gift that keeps on giving, the good old cold. Welcome to it. The last thing I will hit on this bait, and something that is really important with baits that have a little bit more meat to them. I had this bait has a little bit more meat and a little bit more meat to them, so I do select a little bit bigger hook. This is that 4-aught VMC Redline straight shank hook, a heavy, I think it's a heavy duty, I think is what the actual term is. Heavy duty straight shank hook. You want a little bit more bite in your hook because you have a little bit more meat in your plastic. So the thinner the bait that you're rigging up, you can have a little bit lighter or thinner, hook bite or like round bend, basically. And so the bigger profile of the bait, obviously you want a little bit more there. So that's the hookup ratio is key. If you use a smaller hook, your hookup ratio won't be as good as if you use that bigger hook like a 4-aught, that 4-aught VMC. So that was just something there. I will sort of hit on area on the lake where I think this is going to be going down. The whole lake, everywhere, they're going to bite. Now, still keeping the pockets, but I am going to sort of switch it up a little bit. If the water's up, let's just go back here into a flatter creek on Lake St. Clair. Let's go up the main river arm up this way. Come in here. Ooh, that's a nice little cut. Hey, there's a nice little place right there. For sure, that little neck down, for sure I'm cranking a DT6 on that sucker right there. It says bridge, yep. DT6 for sure. He's not there. I'm gonna roll in this creek. I will also say that I have to sort of mention this. When I'm going out on a lake and I don't know what's happening, a lot of times I'll start in a place like this, and I'll start in the mouth and I'll crank that bridge. Then I'll keep my trollo motor down and I'll pick one bank and I'll say, okay, I'm gonna pick this left-hand bank, and I'll start fishing down that whole bank, fishing everything in front of me. So I'll have all these rods set up, and I'll go through a spinnerbait, a crankbait, a flipping stick, with a Bronco bug, with a glide bait, a Madra. I'll do all of these things while I'm sort of like the bank types change and everything, and the fish are sort of like, it's just different. And all of a sudden I'll start picking up patterns. Okay, oh, they're halfway back in the creek. Oh, I got all the way back here, I never got any bites. Or I got all the way back there and all the fish are back there. Then you can start, like a lot of times when I start practice, people ask me this all the time. What do you do when you start practice? All of it looks the same. I put the trollo motor down and I fish fast. I power fish, like what I'm telling you guys to do right here. I cover a lot of water, and then I generate a bite. And then I can generate another bite. And then I determine if that was a pattern or if that was a fluke, right? Then I'm starting to run similar things around the lake, depending on where most bites came from. So I might still fish this whole creek arm that might take me like 2-3 hours, starting off in this left-hand side. And I got a couple bites towards the mouth, and I got a couple bites way back in. So now I'm like, all right, I have two patterns. They're in the mouth, and they're in the very backs. That sort of start to build this pattern. Okay, let me fish this, let me do this. That's sort of how I typically will develop a pattern, especially like in the BPT when I'm trying to run a lot of water and cover a lot of water with a lot of these same techniques. You see what I'm saying? So starting in this creek arm, same sort of deal. Typically when you have a cold night, these steeper banks are always great to fish around these flatter creek arms, because those fish will pull back to those steeper banks, sort of the last depth of water in the area. Like this is a good area, even though it's only 4 feet in the very back. That'd be a great place to go flip the last couple laydowns, or a little rocky bank in the very back of there, or on this bank right here. It doesn't seem deep. Okay, it's only 11 feet deep when the other pocket we just talked about is 30 feet down the lake. Well, up in this area, that's deep. Okay, that's deep in the back of this creek arm. That's deeper. Now there is 30 feet all the way in the mouth right here, but in this area, if the fish is living here, he's going to be, that's going to be his home. It's going to be the deepest water he has along that bank line, or out in the middle, which he might not be living out there in the middle. I'm going to look at that. and flip any little laydowns, anything with a little stained water, and then any little bit of last depth in the very back. Even back here, you can sort of see if the water's not blown out right here, there's not a lot of current, and the water temperature doesn't drop, these last little turns, ooh, they get back there because the water will warm up quicker, and that's a good area to sort of fish. Okay, last but not least, I have to mention this because it's a bait that just catches so many bass, and you can't go wrong with it. It just generates bites. Mr. Chatterbait. Mr. Chatterbait catches a lot of bass. He gets a lot of bites, and he's got to be in the top baits in the month of March because, to me, this is a great bait to cover water. It's a great bait to generate a lot of bites and cover water. I really like a chatterbait around boat docks this time of year. You guys might see me throw a chatterbait on Murray next week with around a boat dock because I love that. Like there's nothing better to me if I wind like a chatterbait or spinnerbait. But see, I can cover more water with a chatterbait. So if the water's dirty, I'm gonna throw a spinnerbait because it'll slow my retrieve down. But if I'm covering water, I'll pick the chatterbait up and I'll cover and I'll go for, like in practice, I'll just go. And I might be like, oh, they're on this deal, right? All right, they're in the backs of the creeks, or they're this, they're doing that. And then if the water clarity's dirty, say I got 2 bites down this whole stretch, right? There's a little rocky bank, and there's a couple docks, and I got 2 bites on the docks, and I got 2 bites on the rock stretch. Then I can sort of slow down. If the water's dirty, I might slow down on the spinnerbait in actual tournament. Like slowly take my time down through there. Or I might throw the chatterbait down through there the first time, then I go down the exact same bank at a different angle and do the spinnerbait. So it's just a way to generate bites, and I feel like it's just, yeah, you can't go wrong with a chatterbait this time of year, especially for my friends that have a lot of grass, and like, so your Gunnersville fishermen, of course, down there in Texas, anywhere that has grass, you just can't go wrong with a chatterbait. It's just a bait that just comes through grass so well, but works well on hard bottom places, and works well on points, works well on all that other stuff. I mean, it's a good one. So I'm not gonna go too far in on this one. I like a 1/2 ounce. This is a Jackhammer. Colors, you can change it up depending on what you like. I do throw a green pumpkin with a Fire Craw freeloader on the back a lot of times, and the water clarity is just a little stained. I actually called that out in a video on Instagram. I did a little reel on that, talking about, that's one of my favorite setups for this time of year as well. It gets bites. So this one's just more of a shad color, a little bit low key, but definitely a fish catcher, and you can't go wrong with that. So a lot of different baits to choose from, a lot of different things. I did not hit on a lipless crankbait, which I talked about in the previous video. So if you want to talk, or if you want to listen a little bit about what my mindset was on a lipless this time of year, it's another good bait to throw in the month of March. It really is. I mean, there's so many other baits that I can mention, but those are the baits that I mean, a jerk bait's still a good one. I mean, there's just, I could have 15 baits that I am throwing in the month of March, but I hit on the ones that I feel like generate the most bites, and historically, day in and day out, will generate some of the biggest bites and biggest bass in your bodies of water this March. Period, bar none. Let me know if these help you guys out. Comment below, let me know if you guys do end up going out this March, which I hope you're out there. Come on, buy them fishing licenses, get out there on your lake, whether you're in a kayak, whether you're on the bank, it does not matter. It is the time to go bass fishing. This is bass fishing season. Let's do it. We'll see you on the next one.